On August 13th, 1971, the cover of Life magazine featured an image of two women. Just turn it down, I'm pretty loud, so just turn it slightly until we get to the feedback point. Alright, start one more time. On August 13th, 1971, the cover of Life magazine featured the image of two women standing side by side. On the right, this is a little confusing, right? The right, you're right, I know this is my left. On the right, a classical painted image of a tall, naked woman stands head and shoulders above a second woman who is contemporary and modern and fully dressed. And the figure on the right is clearly the biblical figure of Eve. She's covered with a strategically placed fig leaf, and that's it, and is holding, of course, an apple. The modern feminist beside her holds a sign that says, "Eve was framed." Eve was framed, but for this morning, I'd like us to explore an additional angle on that ancient story. Not only was Eve framed, but the serpent was right. The biblical creation myth at the beginning of the book of Genesis tells us that in the middle of the primordial Garden of Eden, God planted the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And God commanded Adam, that archetypal first man, "You may freely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die." It's pretty ominous. We're told as well that God made woman and that the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. The twist comes when the serpent enters the picture. The serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals that God had made. And the serpent tells the woman that she should eat the forbidden fruit. "You will not die," the serpent says. "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and that the tree was desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit and she ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Next comes the part about God investigating this disobedience, this transgression. Adam's cowardly scapegoating of Eve, and God meting out various curses of punishment to Adam, to Eve, and to the serpent. But here's another important part. As God prepares to banish Adam and Eve from the garden of forever, God says to the other members of the divine court, presumably the angels, etc., "The man has now become like one of us." That's the most familiar version of the Adam and Eve story. But here's another version from a book written in the 2nd and 3rd century called The Testimony of Truth. From the non-canonical Christian writings, the writings excluded from the official authorized list of books that Christians should read, according to the Orthodox Church. Regarding the Orthodox version of the Adam and Eve story, The Testimony of Truth says, "What sort of God is this? God envied Adam that he should eat of the tree of knowledge. And afterward God said, 'Let us cast them out of this place, lest they eat of the tree of life and live forever.' Surely God has shown himself to be a malicious envier." And I use that word, I don't usually refer to God as him, but I think that himself is important here because that text emerges very much out of patriarchy. Similar questions have gotten many a precocious child in trouble. How can God punish Adam and Eve for eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil? They're punished for eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil when before eating of the fruit of that tree, they didn't know the difference between good and evil. Think about it. And did God lie when God said, "But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for the day you eat of it you shall die in that day"? Even according to the canonical Bible, the serpent was right on that count. As the serpent hissed into Eve's ear, "You will not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will just be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. One key to understanding the dynamics at play underneath and moving within this ancient biblical myth is the many layers of meaning around that word, knowledge. I suspect that many of you have heard the phrase, he knew her in the biblical sense, right? Meaning carnal knowledge, embodied knowledge. Notice that immediately after Adam and Eve are banished from the garden for eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we read in the next verse, the very next verse, that the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain. That same Hebrew word for knowledge, yada, is used both for the knowledge of good and evil, as well as for Adam knowing his wife in such a way that Cain was born 9 months later. I think you get my meaning. This connection is intentional between being mature enough to comprehend moral complexity, good and evil, and being mature enough to be self-aware of sexuality. The capability of understanding the messiness, the complexity, all the gray areas that we know exist in our adult moral reasoning emerges about the same time as adolescence and puberty, as our bodies begin to change. So we can see in the trajectory of human psychosexual development that that's the root of this correlation between eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and one's body beginning to come into fruition, if you will, that brings a very different kind of knowledge, a carnal knowledge, sometimes called a loss of innocence, just like Adam and Eve could never go back into the garden where they could play and frolic freely and naked and be fully unashamed. Similarly, consider that God is depicted in the story very much like a stereotype of the parent of a young child who is too young to know the difference between good and evil in a full, adult, complex way. Adam and Eve are told not to not eat the forbidden fruit, not for some adult, rational reason, but why? Because I told you so, right? And God, as many parents have, tells an exaggerated white lie. If you eat of that fruit, you'll die, right? To try to keep them away from adult matters that they're not ready and can't be explained to them yet in a way that they can understand why it's not for them yet. Some of you may have read Meg Wolitzer's 2014 novel, The Interestings. Anybody? Okay, one. Do you like it? All right. It's been getting a lot of buzz. Her earlier 2005 novel, The Position. Anybody read that? All right. Also well reviewed. It's about the children of parents who, before they had children, published a book together about their sex lives, specifically about the position that they enjoyed. And Wolitzer's novel tells the story of this couple's 4 children, ages 6 to age 15, stumbling upon that book in 1975, and how it differently affects them, age 6 to 15, how it differently affects them for the rest of their life based on the age they were when they encountered and ate the fruit of this very age-inappropriate, if that's ever appropriate if it's your parents, book. Hashtag Freud, right? Conversely, another riveting and disturbing contemporary parallel is the 2009 Greek independent film Dogtooth. Has anybody seen Dogtooth? Really interesting and disturbing. It's a parallel example about a husband and wife who keep their children ignorant of the world outside their walled property. So they're in Greece and they built this walled property. And they keep their children in the property well into the children's adulthood, totally sequestering them from any knowledge of the outside world. Knowledge, right? That film can be read as a tale of what happens when you stay in the garden too long. So unlike The Position, where they ate of the fruit of the tree too early, they wait too long, and that adult knowledge about morality and sexuality is repressed, and it begins to come out in these really twisted ways. Seriously, just later Google Dogtooth trailer, and in that minute and a half, you'll see what I mean. Keep in mind what Eve sees for herself after the snake hisses in her ear, that if you eat of the forbidden fruit, you will not die. Rather, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, meaning like an adult, right? Adults, after all, sometimes appear quite godlike to children. And like an innocent child, Eve had probably never previously dared go anywhere near that forbidden fruit and that forbidden tree. Not for any sophisticated adult reason, but just because the godparent said so. But with the serpent's encouragement, she boldly crosses the boundary put in place by an authority figure, and the Bible itself tells us that she saw that the fruit of that tree was good for food, that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. She took of its fruit and ate, and gave it to her husband, and we've heard the rest. One way of paraphrasing the barely hidden subtext of the Garden of Eden story is that breaking the commandments of Orthodox religion, the teenagers experimented with drugs and sex. And there were dire consequences, as there sometimes are. Another slightly more hidden meaning is buried in the line that Eve saw that the tree was desired to make one wise. That is, to gain knowledge beyond what one's childhood, community, or family of origin may permit. That could include paradigm-shifting scientific knowledge that people told you wasn't possible. That could include transgressive moral knowledge that challenges the limitations of social norms, as we've seen in our own society of late with interracial marriage, with same-sex marriage. That it turns out eating of that fruit is delightful and really not that big a deal. Remember that the non-canonical Gnostic text, the Testimony of Truth, criticized God as a malicious envier for punishing Adam and Eve for eating from the tree of knowledge, which is basically criticizing God, as depicted in the story, for playing the role of every controlling authority figure who has tried to repress adolescent rebellion in every film and drama and TV show you've ever seen about adolescence. And that word Gnostic comes from the Greek word for to know, and has a silent G, so it's gnostic, just like we have knowledge, right? That's why we have knowledge, silent K, is that because it comes from the word Gnostic. So the Gnostic, those knower Christians, were fascinated with secret spiritual readings of the biblical text and their attractions to the secret mystical realms of the spirit, which they saw as ruled by the one true God, the spiritual realm. It was so extreme for them that they actually thought the material world that we found here was evil, and it was created secretly by a lesser god they called the demiurge, behind the one true God's back, who thought you should just dwell in the realm of spirit. So as you can see from the Testimony of Truth, the Gnostics, the knower Christians, read that Orthodox Christian Genesis story very differently. They saw themselves as an elite group in the know, and that the God of the Genesis story was really a lesser, petty God who wished to prevent humans from growing up and becoming like the true God and understanding the spiritual realm, and empowered with the authority to decide for themselves what is good and evil, what is right and wrong. Gnostic Christians saw the snake as the heroic martyr of the story who risked everything to reveal the secret of humanity's potential for growing up, leaving the confines of the garden for all the glory and all the tragedy of this world in which we find ourselves. As the poet William Blake said more than 2 centuries ago, the Bible must be shaken upside down before it will yield all its secrets. The priests have censored and clipped and mangled. They give us a celibate Jesus born of a virgin without the slightest stain of sexual contact, which is blasphemous nonsense. And by demonizing the snake, Orthodox Christians set themselves on a trajectory that has too often rejected scientific knowledge and stigmatized carnal knowledge of all various sorts. As a child, I was told that the Adam and Eve story is about the fall from a perfect, original state of grace that we wish we could get back to, that's now forever lost to the past. But the ancient Gnostics saw that the snake was hissing at us too, warning us not to long for some allegedly perfect past that we now see never existed and was merely the limited knowledge of childhood innocence, and encouraging us to transgress the false limitations of childhood morality, sexuality, and knowledge, and move toward the future, to grow up and become religious in a way that welcomes and integrates adult knowledge and adult sexuality as normal and a healthy part of life. In a 1784 essay, the philosopher Immanuel Kant said that the motto of the Enlightenment, that time of challenging established norms through the power of human reason, human knowledge, Kant said that the motto of the Enlightenment was dare to know. Dare to know. In the light of the Genesis story, we can hear that motto as another form of the serpent's hiss: take and eat of what you know to be true in your experience. Along these lines, on Tuesday nights, the past few weeks, we've been studying a book by Jeffrey Kripal, who's the chair of the religion department at Rice University, on comparing religions. For this sermon, I'm drawing especially from Kripal's earlier book, The Serpent's Gift, Gnostic Reflections on Religion. For Kripal, there's a radical shift that happens when you move from existing solely within one religious framework to a framework of comparing the world's religions in light of the best of scientific knowledge and in light of one another and one's personal experience. And all we know about psychology and sociology and history and sexuality and more, and bringing all that into the comparative mix. But Kripal, just like the double meaning of knowledge in the book of Genesis, is not only interested in applying post-Enlightenment, rational, scientific knowledge to religion, but also in exploring the equivalent of somatic, carnal, embodied knowledge and religion. Just as Eve discovered that the fruit was good for eating when she tasted it, Kripal is interested in the ways that first-hand experiences of the holy, of the sacred, can change us in profound, full-bodied ways, such that we never see ourselves and this world in the same way again. In other words, don't just read about Buddhism, meditate. Don't just read about the Hindu tradition, try yoga. Don't just read about Judaism and Christianity, feed the hungry, visit the sick, clothe the naked. Don't just write a dissertation about apples, try one. Back in March, I preached another sermon on Kripal titled Religious Mystic and Rational Humanist, the mystical humanism of Jeffrey Kripal. And I'd love to be able to pause right now and say again everything that I said in the 20 minutes of that sermon, but I won't. I'd also like to say everything I said about Feuerbach at the end of the sermon that I preached in February on Atheism for Lent. But I'll suffice it to say that I'll link to those two sermons in the manuscript version that we post on our website. That those are both very relevant to everything that I'm saying today. And I'll plan to provide some further clarity next week when my sermon will be about the conclusions that Kripal reaches in his study of what happens when we compare religions in light of 21st century knowledge and our own firsthand experience. You'll get the 75-minute version on Tuesday, and you'll get the 20-minute recapitulation on Sunday. So come to both, come to either, it's up to you. For now, I'll leave you with these words from Kripal on the fruit that he hopes is being born out of his work at the intersection of academic rigor and of mystical experience, both historic and contemporary. He hopes that we might learn to love the wise snake, to listen to the snake's many hissing whispers, and realize finally, we don't die because we're cursed. We haven't sinned. We haven't fallen from grace. We have sex and reproduce because we're mortal and we know we're going to die and we want to leave a legacy. We don't die because we have sex and reproduce. We've just grown up. I'm grateful to be with you on this journey in which we're encouraged to bring our full selves, all of what we know, to building this beloved, diverse community. In that spirit, I invite you to rise and body your spirit as we sing together hymn 193. Our faith is but a single